I'm absolutely thrilled to invite Clare Woodcraft to be our next speaker on Talking Philanthropy today. Hi there, Clare.
Hi there, Ben.
It's been a while since we were last on Talking Philanthropy. In actual fact, I think you were the co-chair of the last one. So we're really delighted that you've come back to talk to us some more. You've been a bit busy. Let's tell us a bit more about your new appointment first, because you've moved on to Paris, I believe. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yes, indeed, Ben. So before we last spoke with your wonderful Asian audience, and I was at Cambridge, actually, of course, running the Center for Strategic Philanthropy, with a very similar mandate to the new one that I now have in Paris, where I'm working with ESSEC, the French Business School, and I'm newly the executive director of their philanthropy chair. In essence, a similar mandate and mission, as I said, really looking at researching philanthropy, getting more data from the market, really understanding what's happening in the sector, and also looking at executive education, and then, of course, the publishing, dissemination of research. So very similar, and I think really resonates, and I'm sure will resonate with your audience today in that we just don't have enough information on our sector. We know it's growing fast, but we just don't know exactly what's going on out there. So that's really my mission at the moment, to continue to curate and disseminate that information.
That's great to hear. And we're going to be talking about your book, which is the main theme, which is I've got here, and I have read it. So interesting bedtime reading, so to speak. And it's a really phenomenal book, actually. So congratulations to you and your Cambridge College, which we are hearing from earlier on in the Talking Philanthropy, and the wonderful work that the Institute and the work of Cambridge has done in this space, and particularly around the theme that we're going to talk about all day today at Talking Philanthropy, which is wealth transfer, and that issue about how that transfer can take place. But to dive into your book, so first of all, Clare, what possessed you to write, I think, the first book possibly on philanthropy of the Global South? Certainly, having looked at it, I think it's probably the most comprehensive. What possessed you and the editorial team and the team at Cambridge to put this together?
Yeah, so well, therein lies the answer, actually, in the sense that there, as you said, there is so little. There is so little. We did literature reviews when we first set up the center as to who is researching philanthropy in the Global South, what currently exists. We were setting up the education programs, looking for case studies from the Global South, and there simply wasn't any stuff out there. And we were like, well, this is a real challenge. There's a real gap in the market that we need to fill. So that was kind of really driving the mission at the center anyway. And then more latterly, of course, after we did our COVID-19 report, looking at what was happening during the crisis, we said, what's happened post the crisis? Wouldn't it be great to hear from people in the market, those leaders in the Global South from whom we don't hear often enough, as to what happened during and post-COVID, but more broadly, what's happening generally in the market. And I talk about the book as, a one-stop shop for people who are either already operating in the Global South, because it's a real compendium of the different regions, but also those who are interested in operating in the Global South, giving to the Global South, or already have a philanthropic mission in the Global South and want to understand what their peers are up to. So that was really the mission behind the book, was first and foremost to offset this dearth of information and case and stories, these incredible stories of innovation and resilience that hadn't been captured. But we also wanted to address the growing movement. You will remember in our earlier discussions, the Shift the Power movement that was kind of in the DNA of our institutional structure at Cambridge, because we recognized that for so long, the norms and the context of philanthropy had been set by the global north, and that we simply weren't hearing the voice of the Global South, and that we weren't hearing the stories of the narrative of the Global South. So we really wanted to offset that power imbalance and amplify the voice of the Global South. And I often say now that, we can talk more about the content of the book, but to me, the opportunity of the book is creating this community of leaders, peer leaders in the Global South, to really amplify the understanding of what's happening in these markets and the opportunity for engaging. So that's really what drove us in the beginning.
It certainly does that, and it's a fantastic framework and links together such a huge subject across such a huge geographical area. One of the things that really struck me, Claire, was last time when you co-chaired the last Talking Philanthropy, it was about the philanthropic ecosystem and the role of government in Asia. That's one theme that comes out very strongly, the importance of government.
Mm-hmm.
But the other theme, perhaps we'll start first, is around the whole issue of COVID and the implication of COVID. So as again, the last Talking Philanthropy, we were just coming out of the other end of that, albeit we couldn't still meet as a group, so it was all online. But COVID really had a profound impact in the findings of the book. Perhaps you could talk through, first of all, the COVID factor, and then perhaps the government factor and how that differs.
Absolutely. So as you said, there is, a wide spectrum of ideas in the book, and that is part of the complexity when I do things like this, try and articulate succinctly what the book is talking about. And I think COVID does complicate things because it was such a complex, such a deep crisis, which we still feel. But when we were first setting up the center, it was when COVID first hit, and we did a small report on COVID-19, which was like a natural experiment, just capturing what was actually happening during the crisis. Were people changing their methodologies, their approach to giving, in order to be more flexible, to be more understanding, to listen more to beneficiaries, to enable them more, to empower them more? All the things that we've been talking about for a long time in the sector. So we wanted to then look at, through the book, what had changed since we wrote that first report on COVID-19. So during the actual crisis in COVID, we did see a change. So some good stuff, some not so good. So some of the unfortunate things that happened during the beginning of the crisis is that we saw global north donors, philanthropy, focusing more on its domestic market. So global south recipients, and I don't like to use that word because again, it seems to reconfirm the power imbalance. But those who were receiving funds in the global south from the global north, suddenly finding themselves out in the cold and being forced to really focus on their own resilience and to innovate in the sense that, okay, so these funds that we were historically dependent on, which we never wanted, which we never liked, is this an opportunity through crisis to be able to address that and fortify ourselves financially so that, if nothing else comes of the crisis, at least when we come out the other side, we have more financially viable funding models. So within the case studies that you see in the book, there is that is what's underwriting the book, is these authors are writing about how COVID helped transform their models and what that means for them currently in terms of their resilience and their ability to generate more impact, and most importantly, to generate impact without being constantly dependent on, seeking resources in far off regions, when in actual fact, there may be opportunities locally, given, and this perhaps goes back to your next two questions, given the growth in these markets, this intergenerational wealth transfer. So we know there is a growing amount of philanthropy coming to market, but I guess the question is, how can we ensure that this new philanthropic capital doesn't make the mistakes of the past and is focused on building sectoral resilience such that these organizations can face another crisis? Because frankly, as Mohammed Al-Arian, who wrote the foreword for our book, in his own book writes about perma-crisis. Crisis is not going away. And what we saw during COVID was that many organizations struggled because they had no reserves. So we know the third sector has this fragility and vulnerability, and COVID really exacerbated that. So if you lose funding from one key source and you don't have reserves, you simply go under. And this was the tragedy of the crisis. But what we'd like to think is that, the book was an opportunity to share how to avoid those issues in the future.
So the issues of reserves, also that issue of unrestricted giving, where people responded very quickly and actually found out that was rather a good way of giving grants to trust the organization. That then links into sort of the decolonization debate as well, which I think is an interesting feature of this whole discussion. But what about that role of government that we also talked about at the last Talking Philanthropy? It seems that is kind of the big difference in terms of a defining difference in terms of how do you work with government. And your examples in the book and from Indonesia and Malaysia, the two that I like to pick up on, were really good examples of actually philanthropists working with government. So is that something that's quite striking? What's your sense of how important government is in the global south?
Absolutely. But just before I answer that question, Ben, I just do want to touch on the unrestricted one, because I think we saw some, during the crisis, we saw some incredible transformation of the way people were giving. As you said, much more trust-based, empowering local communities, conscious of that movement to decolonize, and some incredible stories of foundations saying, yeah, we used to have this like 6 months due diligence process. Now we ask them within 3 days to fill out a form, and we trust them, we know them. And my favorite example is one of an African foundation who said, look, this is such a severe crisis. We're giving grants based on a WhatsApp, a WhatsApp application, just somebody over a WhatsApp voice message saying, it's a desperate situation. This is what we need. Please help us out. So I think we should remember that COVID really did trigger a change in this whole approach to restricted or versus unrestricted. And I, have been championing unrestricted for decades. I really wish we could just mainstream it once and for all. But COVID did drive a change of behavior, but I would suggest that it hasn't necessarily post-COVID been institutionalized. So we're seeing some of that innovation disappear. Coming to the point of government, so absolutely. So when you work in these global south markets, when you are defining your interventions based on frameworks such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, you can't help but look at what governments are doing. And I would say, not even just in the global south, in any market, philanthropy is risk capital. It's here to test and create new ideas to solve complex, entrenched socioeconomic problems. But philanthropy can't scale many of these solutions. You need governments for that. So if you're going to deploy philanthropic capital effectively, if you're going to be, like I always used to say when I worked at Shell Foundation, we were like the crazy scientists in this lab testing new solutions. If you're going to be the crazy scientist testing new solutions with your risk capital, you have to have a plan for scale. And it's very rare that you're going to be able to do it alone. Even some of the huge US foundations, if you want to drive system change, you simply cannot go it alone. So for me, the first port of call, if you want to ensure that your intervention is scalable, is looking at government. So what are they already doing? Actually, before you even start, what is the gap? What is the government not doing? Where can we help? Maybe there's an area of education or health where the government, often I hear in the markets where I work, the government's doing very little for teacher training. Okay, great. Can we drive innovation for teacher training in these markets that the government can then scale? So I think it's really important that you align with government public policy. Now, what our COVID research did, and in the book, is really look at, so how does that happen? How do you create these partnerships with governments? Because quite frankly, in many markets, the government doesn't want to talk to foundations. They are often suspicious of foundations or, private philanthropic capital, whether it's a foundation or coming from a donor advised fund or wherever it's coming from. There's this suspicion that somehow philanthropy is not accountable and it's coming in to try and take over from the government or challenge the existing regime. So that suspicion, we had always heard about that. That's nothing new to anyone in this audience. But what we saw during COVID was this sudden awakening for public sector bureaucrats, if you like, around the opportunity of partnering with philanthropists. So first of all, there was the obvious, understanding that this is a growth market, that there is some significant capital coming into the philanthropic sector, and maybe governments might like to access some of that capital. But more importantly, I think the government's understanding really what philanthropy was all about and philanthropists' ability to innovate. So we have these two wonderful examples of the Tanoto Foundation and the YTL Foundation. We actually even heard from others, including a Brazilian foundation, where I remember this story they told us, for decades we've been flying across Brazil, such a huge country, hours on planes, trying to convince governments to work with us on digital education, spending loads on travel expenses. No one was listening. And suddenly, overnight, the Brazilian government was on Zoom with us. And in half an hour, we've convinced them. Oops, I lost my headphone. We've convinced them of the opportunity of philanthropic capital and the opportunity for partnering. So that is replicated Tonoto Foundation that many of your audience will be familiar with. And of course, our dear friend Satriho Tanujojo, who is speaking at your event, who is from Indonesia and was heading up the Tonoto Foundation until recently. They built their whole strategic model when they underwent a strategy refresh, really working in partnership with the government. They understood from the very beginning that if you're working in education, you cannot do it alone. And they have wonderful examples of how to work with complex governments, because governments are complex, particularly in Indonesia, given the geography. And the Tonoto Foundation just found these really intelligent ways of calibrating, working with local government versus working with sovereign government or federal government, if you like, and working with a very new, innovative minister that came to be during that time. So I think that's the strength of the Tonoto Foundation case study, is helping others understand how you go about it. Because as a foundation, it's very easy to sort of hunker down and just go it alone and just say, we're just going to launch this program. 5 or 10 years in, you go, we're not getting the impact we wanted. And you realize because it's not scalable. And Tonoto Foundation really nailed that from the outset. They said, we want to engage with government, local, federal. We're going to understand them, help them understand how we can help them. And as the Triho will no doubt talk to you about, is the opportunity of bringing on board international networks that can help governments as well. The relationships that Tonoto Foundation had with the UN, with the World Bank, that was really powerful, that they could help governments access or navigate those relationships, let's say. So that's a brilliant example. And YTL similarly, YTL had also, a bit like our Brazilian foundation, had been, YTL in Malaysia, of course, had been looking for a long time at how to support government on digitizing education. And then COVID just created this incredible opportunity to fast track that work. And no longer did they need to, sort of scream till they're blue in the face about the value of this, because of course the nature of the crisis was such that digital education became a must for everybody. And they were extremely well positioned then to offer up solutions. And I think it's important that we remember that, philanthropy is about finding solutions. And that's really what this book is about sharing those solutions so others can learn from them or even collaborate with them.
And both the speakers from both those organizations spoke at the last Talking Philanthropy as well. So, and it's quite remarkable seeing the YTL, the concept being jettisoned across the whole of Malaysia and Southeast Asia, and how that partnership with government just materialized at that moment. So I think it's another great case, as with so many of the brilliant cases in this book. So looking ahead, and we've only got limited time to talk such a massive subject. Clearly, everyone knows the big growth of wealth transfer is going to happen in certainly Asia and a substantial amount in the global south. And yet this is the first book to document and case study the philanthropic work of so many families that are very much at the leading edge of that wealth transfer. Just on a sort of leading final note, what's your sense of the future for the global south and building on the work of this book? Because I'll be interested to know, are you an optimist or a pessimist in terms of how this whole sector is going to develop?
So I will say up front, I'm very optimistic, and I think that the Global South will create a huge amount of experience and lessons learned that foundations in the Global North can learn from. Because there is a level of innovation that is necessitated by the institutional nature of Global South governments, government societies, economies, if you like, that are less mature economies in some cases, where philanthropy has been super innovative in responding to needs of the market. Let's not forget, in most of these countries, philanthropy is not driven by some kind of fiscal benefit. It's driven by a genuine commitment to wanting to support in the transformation of societies, be it in education or health or beyond. So I'm very optimistic in the sense that this is growing as capital markets mature. There is this intergenerational wealth transfer. You hear multiple numbers, billions, trillions of dollars, but clearly a very significant amount of wealth that is going to come into the philanthropic sector. And a new generation, a younger generation that is very keen to deploy that entrepreneurially. So gone are the days of where we're looking at, bureaucratic foundations that are check writing. These are very entrepreneurial foundations. They understand they have to ideate, innovate, iterate. This is really the direction of travel. And I think that there's much for others to learn from this level of entrepreneurial thinking that we see across these global South markets. The second thing I would say is that we see a huge level of collaboration between these global South markets. And that's really our mission with this book as well, is to create this community so that if I'm driving system change in Malaysia, I can share that with my colleagues in Brazil and vice versa. If I'm in Africa working on new healthcare, a region-wide, a continent-wide healthcare proposition, that I can share that with Southeast Asia. So it's really about trying to share opportunities and innovation and entrepreneurial thinking, because that's what we're going to need. If we're going to address the situation of perma-crisis, that's what we're going to need. This book is really for us just the beginning. As you know, we've started already book number 2. And I think that's our mission, is to continue to create this community, promote collaboration, peer learning. And I think that we in the global North still have a lot to learn from our counterparts in the global South.
Where philanthropy is very deep and very long. We need to remember that. So that's for sure. Clare, absolute pleasure to talk with you. And I'm sure everyone that's listening to this and at Talking Philanthropy will be now rushing off to order your book, which I do recommend. It's absolutely fantastic book to get, and a great source of reference as well as inspiration. And also that note about the next generation obviously is so profound with these discussions today, and all of our discussions about how that next generation is forming its own philanthropic behaviors and patterns. And this concept of partnership and working with government and unrestricted and being innovative, I think, are really key themes that both come out of your book, but also I'm sure will come out of all the discussions. So Clare, thank you so much. And thank you, your colleagues as well, for contributing today. And thank you for your contributions specifically around this book. Please, everyone that's listening to that, please go and get it and have a read. And congratulations on producing something that I think probably historically for philanthropy, people will look back and see this as a real moment of documenting some real shifts and some real developments. And I'm quite sure, as you say, that the future is very bright for the development of philanthropy in the Global South. So this is a wonderful document, and thank you. So thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Ben. Wishing you and all the audience wonderful discussion. Thanks again.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye. Thanks, Clare.